Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is World War II and specifically World War II abroad. We'll talk more about the domestic issues in the next lecture. Before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to the right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical context. With that, let's begin. So we left off talking about FDR, right? And the New Deal. And for FDR, and most Americans were primarily concerned with ending the Great Depression here at home. Foreign affairs were one of the furthest things from their minds. Add to the Depression the horrors of World War I, an enormously unpopular war, and Americans were in no mood to intervene in the world global affairs again. After World War I, we had this huge wave of isolationist sentiment that swept across the American people. Remember, we started banning immigrants from Europe. We started having, Warren Harding's message, America First platform. But remember, the Depression itself was not a U.S. phenomenon, not solely a U.S. issue. Remember, the world economies are intertwined, and America was far from alone in dealing with the Depression. And the New Deal, in a larger context, was simply just America's response to the Depression. Elsewhere in the world, the response to the Depression would help facilitate a rise in totalitarian, authoritarian, and dictator style of governments. Thus, the Depression is going to help lead us to World War II. Because while FDR refused to become a dictator, and FDR used the New Deal, that's not how everyone else in the world handled it. For example, let's talk about fascism, Benito Mussolini. Now, in Italy, Benito Mussolini seized power in 1920, so early after World War II. Remember, he was a World War I veteran himself, and when he returned he helped to organize a fascist government. Now, what is fascism? That's a good question, because that word has been thrown around a lot in 2020 with the race riots and the other social justice movements across our country. And it's been thrown around a lot saying, oh, these far left fascists. Well, traditionally speaking, again, I'm not saying you can't, but traditionally speaking, fascism is actually far right. Yes, you heard that right. Fascism is far right because, yes, it is socialist, which is usually more left, but it's a hybrid blend of socialism and nationalism. And nationalism is more traditionally a far right thing, a far right radical thing. And so what he does is he blends socialism and nationalism and creates fascism. And he promises to restore order and national pride. In other words, make Italy great again. Because quite honestly, Italy was pissed after World War I. Remember, they originally were with the Central Power with Germany. They switched sides after a year and joined the Allies. And they assumed that after the Treaty of Versailles, they would get some big dividends, and they didn't. They got very little spoils after the war. And so once he assumes power in 1922, he immediately suppresses political opposition. He suppresses free press. And in 1925, he assumes dictator powers and was largely able to pull Italy out of the Depression once it starts by massive public works projects and building the military. If you ever go to Italy, there's some gorgeous buildings that if you want to go see the Colosseum and see all this old Renaissance architecture, it's beautiful. But right in the middle of it all is architecture and buildings that Mussolini built. They're gorgeous. But he put people to work. He built the military. You're going to see a trend here, by the way. And then, of course, just to his north, the most famous fascist of all, Adolf Hitler. Now, consider Germany, which, of course, is going to be very important in World War II. Remember, Germany also was struggling to deal with the Depression. The problem is they've had a struggle since World War I. Remember in 1919, there was the new democratic government known as the Weimar Republic. And they were kind of appointed to rule Germany. Now, the problem is this government was pretty ineffective and pretty much hated because basically they were put in place to replace the Kaiser, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. And their basically first order of duty was to wave the white flag and surrender, and then sign the Treaty of Versailles, which is hated by Germans because it basically assigned them all the guilt. Known as the War Guilt Clause, they have to pay all the reparations. And so they're billions of dollars in debt, and they're not allowed to rebuild their military, which is a very prominent way to help grow your economy. And so during the 1920s, even when Germany was surviving under this government, there was a lot of anti-Weimar Republic sentiment, including a former World War I veteran, Adolf Hitler. Now, he was actually hired as a private investigator, and he was hired to go spy on these fringe radical organizations, political groups. And one of them he went to spy on was a group known as the National Socialist Party, later the Nazi Party. And while he's spying on them, he became enamored with their ideas. And he quickly assumes kind of a leading role in the party. And guys, he's a fascinating, I could spend a whole semester basically on Hitler. I've had history of the Holocaust. I've had this course in undergrad. I love this topic. Take a good European history course, take a good Holocaust course. It's fascinating to talk about Hitler. Long story short, though, and this is very important to the topic, in the late 1920s, as the Depression hits, the Nazi Party's offering answers. The Weimar Republic looks weak. And through the democratically elected process, the Nazi Party becomes the leading party, the majority party in the Reichstag, the Congress of Germany. Well, as the leader, as the majority party, they are going to choose a chancellor from their party, and they convince the president, von Hindenburg, to appoint Adolf Hitler as chancellor, which is theoretically second in command. And so in 1933, he becomes chancellor. Well, and then in 1934, there's a fire at the Reichstag, which is the Capitol building for the government in Germany. It is someone arsons it and goes up in flames. And very coincidentally, they're able to say, "Ooh, it's that guy right there. He's got the gas can in his hand, it's him." Now, everyone believes that Nazi Party basically framed this guy. They paid him to do it. It was all set up. But Adolf Hitler was able to use this situation, this national emergency, right? The Capitol building of Germany was set on fire. This creates a national panic about law and order and safety. So when things are going up in flames and the leader of your country says, "I'm for law and order, I will stop this violence." And in this case, the German people and the German government authorized a clause in the German constitution that granted temporary dictator powers for 1 year to the chancellor, Adolf Hitler, to restore order. Now, he does, well, to the best visibility. He assumes dictator powers for 1 year, and by the time that year is up, the President von Hindenburg is dying, and he never gives up that power. And in fact, by 1935, he merges the office of the chancellor and the presidency, and he becomes unquestioned Führer, dictator, of this Nazi party, which again is a fascist group. So what does he do next? Remember, his whole model here is pull him out of the Depression, make Germany great again. Remember, Germany has been humiliated thanks to the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. He wants to make Germany great again. He's going to do so through law and order. He's going to do so through rebuilding national pride. So his first thing he does, he pulls out the League of Nations, which, by the way, is illegal, according to the Treaty of Versailles. He begins to start rearming Germany, building up the military, in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. He establishes a Nazi police state, whereby he has a secret police force that he sends throughout the country to quell rebellion and political dissenters. Then when he wants to say, well, here's the problem. See, we have all these problems, but here's who you blame. Jews, radical leftists. Remember, he's far right, or he's fascist. He's on the far right spectrum, not left. So leftists, homosexuals, communists. Remember, communists are far left. And then he began using his rebuilt military to start territorial expansion, again, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The result, again, let's step back from Hitler, take away the moral argument for a second. Yes, he's a lying, deceiving, vile, despicable human being who deserves to rot in hell. Okay? For what he does with the Holocaust. But if you just look at his economic policy for Germany, he does make Germany great again. He pulls them out of the Depression in record time versus the United States that spent, 8 years with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal and was still not out of the Depression. He pulls them out in a matter of 2 years. They're thriving. They host the 36 Olympics in Berlin and show off to the world how great fascism, Nazism is. Yeah, this whole Jesse Owens issue, but they're great. He's able to pull them out because of the rebuilding the military and large public works projects. Things like pharmaceuticals, IG Farben. Things like road building. He builds freeway systems. Things like the Autobahn, which still exists as one of the premier roads in the world. That was Adolf Hitler. He starts a brand new car company called the People's Car. You may know as Volkswagen. That was a Hitler idea. And as a result of this, he's able to pull Germany out of the Depression in record time. Where the United States is lagging behind, where the rest of Europe is lagging behind in this. Which is one of the reasons why no one reached out to stop Adolf Hitler when he began to expand territory, because they were still dealing with the Depression themselves. People like France and Britain. Oh, then there's Japan. Now, Japan's a different story, because much like the United States back in the late 19th century, Japan had their own imperialist visions. And they began to expand and get colonies, much like the United States did during the Gilded Age, right? In their imperialism period at the end of the 19th century. But see, Japan was this weird thing that most Western nations couldn't explain. Remember, they're an Eastern nation, they're an Asian nation, but they were modernized. Because what happened was when the United States had the Great White Fleet to go not invade Japan, but open their ports, Japan realized that if they don't modernize and industrialize, they're going to be conquered and taken over much like the Philippines and much like China is. And so they begin to industrialize and they begin to militarize. And the result was in the early 1900s, they beat Russia in a war, the Russo-Japanese War, 1905. And by the time 1940s come around, they are a formidable foe who is an industrial power that's on par and equal to Western nations. And so when the Depression hits, because they have large public works projects and extreme spending in military, the Depression never really hits Japan. Instead, they begin to expand during the early Depression. And so in 1931, they're going to invade Manchuria, this border region between Russia and China. And they do it under false pretenses, but they take it over and create a puppet state known as Manchukuo. And again, this gives them a foothold in the mainland to access the riches of China and to prevent a buffer against Russia. Now, officially, the world community, including the United States, said, bad Japan. It's bad. The United States will actually never recognize the official takeover of Manchukuo. But nonetheless, they're expanding. And then, in 1937, they begin to expand further into mainland China, which is now knocking on our interests. Remember that open door policy? Yeah, we're still in China. And Japan wants more. And so, remember, Japan was theoretically an ally during World War I who thought by fighting in World War I on behalf of the Allies, Britain, US, France, that they would get some kind of spoils from the war. And they didn't get anything, so they're pissed. And so in 1937, they invade mainland China in a place called Nanking. And in Nanking, in December 13, 1937, the capital of the Chinese nationalist faction, the old traditional capital of China, they will force the Chinese to surrender. And over the next 6 weeks, Japan will engage in the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Chinese, committing multiple atrocities, including mass murder, execution, mutilation, rape, and robbery, even burying people alive. But the result of this for Japan was a rapid expansion to expand their territory. And you see, by 1941, this little island off the coast of Asia has now controls large amounts of land. They are, in fact, an empire, and did so by themselves. So we have these far right-wing, so ultra-conservative, totalitarian governments, right? These are far right-wing fascist military governments that are ultra-conservative, far right. And of course, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Soviet Union, which is far left communism. Which is interesting because if you know anything about history, fascism and communism hate each other, even though in many respects they're very similar. Because both employ scare tactics, both involve secret police, high military, lots of state building as far as infrastructure building. They usually censor the press, and they rule with a dictator-type force. But the way I like to explain this, to me, is a very important concept to understand. So you have a piece of paper here, right? And so on the far right over here, which is, I believe, on your left, it's all over here, the far right over here, it's going to be backwards to me, you have fascism, the extreme far left. Now the far right over here, on the far left over here, you have communism. So far right fascism, far left communism. And we look at this as a timeline, basically, right? That's how we look at this idea of radicalism. Of course, you have the center right here in the middle, right? You can go left or right, etc. But the reality is, what's so revolutionary about it, let me back up so you can see it's really easy. So you have this piece of paper here. And you have far right, far left, fascism, communism. They're arch enemies. The thing is, they're actually quite similar in many respects. Because what happens is, we're looking at it all wrong. Extreme left and right, far right and left radicals are not, while they disagree on many things, they're not that different. Because the political spectrum is not a flat line. Rather it's a circle that folds in on itself. And so, yes, there's still the center on this side. So we have the center over here. But on the back side, those two radical points basically meet. Now, they're not saying they're going to agree with each other. They don't. But in many respects, they overlap, even though they hate each other. And yes, communism and fascism hated each other. But again, I want you to understand that concept of what's going on in the world. Again, take a good European history course, understand this better. Nonetheless, how does the United States respond to all this? Well, with basically the left carryover from the World War I, isolationism, neutrality. So storm clouds are brewing on the international stage. War is brewing. And what does the United States do? Yeah, we're going to stay out of this because we're dealing with the domestic impact of the Great Depression. And just to make sure, Wilson, like Wilson, like Woodrow Wilson, FDR is going to get up and, while he will publicly denounce things like this, he also will not go far and resist going and pulling the United States into another war in Europe. But a chain of events began to change things and push us to the brink of war. The first one, of course, was, well, this. Japan is on the move. Secondly, Mussolini begins to expand as well. He went and took Ethiopia in 1935. He spans into Ethiopia and takes over the Ethiopian nation because, again, they felt they got screwed after the First World War. They got nothing, so they went and took Ethiopia by force. And when no one stops them, no one tells them, no, you can't do this, no one prevents it, they become more and more hardened. Third, Hitler begins to expand. And once again, the only response to it was, bad Hitler, bad. And then finally, fascism began to spread in other countries. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War took place, and General Francisco Franco, with aid from both Italy and Germany, was able to overthrow the Spanish monarchy and install a fascist government in Spain. And so as a result of this, Franco right there, as a result of this, do we want to get involved? No. In fact, there's a Gallup poll done in 1937 that 94% of Americans agreed on one thing: stay out of the war. Nonetheless, 1937, FDR does get up and gives a speech condemning Japanese occupation in China, comparing it to a skin disease. And he's warning that there's a problem coming. Like, he knows the problem's coming. He can't go to war yet, but the problem's coming. Of course, you see on the screen says, when an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, in this case, militarism, nationalism, spreading in China, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease. In other words, we need to rise up as a global community and prevent this, to prevent it from spreading further. War is a contagion, whether declared or undeclared. It can engage peoples remote. It can engage peoples far from the remote of the scene of original hostilities. It can engulf states and peoples remote from the original scene of hostility. In other words, if you don't stop what Japan's doing, and then later Mussolini, Hitler, Franco are doing, it's going to keep spreading like it did with Franco in Spain. FDR is urging the international community, because remember, we're staying out of it. And quite honestly, FDR wants to help these nations, these victimized nations, but he realizes if he does, it might lead us to war. And the problem is Congress sees this, and the Congress sees that FDR is like getting awfully close here. He's tempting now. And so in 1930s, starting in 1935, Congress are going to pass a series of laws called the Neutrality Acts. Now, remember, our problem with World War I was we were selling to both sides, but 80+% of our sales went to Britain, which made sense, but we weren't neutral, obviously. And so with the Neutrality Acts, Congress forbade the sale of arms and ammunition to all warring nations. In 1936, they extended the law and added a provision that would forbid loans. So not just giving arms, but not giving any money or loans to warring nations. And again, these Neutrality Acts prevent the United States from intervening in places like Spain when fascism begins to reign there. So here's where we're at. 1936, 1937, Japan's on the move. Mussolini's on the move in Ethiopia. Hitler's beginning to expand, take back land that was lost in World War I, like the Anschluss. Take back parts of Austria-Hungary, take parts of Czechoslovakia. And as the German army moves into Czechoslovakia in 1939, FDR finally says, enough. Staying out of the war is not going to be a possibility. He urges Congress to amend the Neutrality Acts to allow the United States to sell to our allies of Britain and France, and Congress refuses. However, September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. And this, of course, marks the start of World War II, and Congress finally caves and allows us to supply Britain and France. Again, we are no longer neutral. World War II has started. We are not going to war yet, but we're going to start selling war supplies. And there's a big change here. So 1937, that 94% of Americans were against war altogether, no part of it. By 1939, when the war officially starts, World War II, American political opinion began to evolve. Americans still opposed war, granted, but they supported just about everything short of war to allow America to help our European allies. The editor of the journal, The Nation, wrote, quote, "What the majority of the American people want is to be as unneutral as possible without getting into war," unquote. Now, of course, by 1940, Germany begins to expand. In April, Nazi rolled into Denmark. He then went into Norway. By April, he attacked and rolled into the Netherlands. And by June, he had taken and sacked Paris. Think of this. Between April and June, Hitler was able to take Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and Paris, splitting France in half, installing a puppet state. He did so because he was very innovative. Those around him were as well, and they employed this new military tactic known as Blitzkrieg. Now, I'm going to give you a simplified, very oversimplified definition of this, in which case, basically what it is you lead with your planes. And you use it to catch your enemy off guard, take out big targets, take away some of their munition plants, and then roll in your tanks. And then behind your tanks, bring in your infantry to clean up the mess. This way you don't risk loss of life on the infantry and save your men. What a dramatic change from World War I, where it was still the old idea, let's stand in front of each other and shoot each other. Again, big difference here. Don't get bogged down like World War I. By this point, FDR says, uh-oh, we're in trouble. This is spring of 1940, and the United States begins building our military. Now, we're not going to war yet, but building our military, and begins releasing more and more planes and ammunition to the British. By summer of 1940, German fighters are now attacking Britain. This becomes known as the Battle of Britain in late summer of 1940. And by the time, even though Britain will not fall, because Blitzkrieg does not work very well because you can't get your tanks and troops as quickly across the English Channel. Remember, Britain's an island nation. And thus, Britain's able to survive. London will not fall, even though it is heavily battered, as you can see here. By November, and of course, this is an election year now, and FDR has served his 2 terms. No president has ever run for a 3rd term and won. Unprecedented. There's no term limit back then. Nowadays, there's a term limit of 2 terms. But remember, 2 terms is only a tradition started by George Washington. And so in 1940, he runs for a 3rd term, at this time as a wartime president. And while it's not quite as big of a landslide, he still wins fairly easily. He beats his Republican opponent, Wendell Wilkie, using the slogan, quote, "You don't switch horses in the middle of a stream," unquote. And he promised voters that America would become, quote, "the great arsenal of democracy," unquote. Because the reality is, by this point, Europe's in trouble. Britain is reeling. They're out of money. And they have been kept using the money they had to buy guns and ammunition and tanks from the United States, but they could no longer afford to do so. So in 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act and said, hey guys, we will lend you these war supplies with the intent you'll pay us back later. Now, the way FDR explained to the American people was, would not you, as a good neighbor, lend your garden hose to your neighbor when their house is on fire? You wouldn't ask them to pay for it first. You would give it to them. Right? That's just being a good neighbor. And so Lend-Lease Act and Roosevelt's ideas that we were just being a good neighbor to Britain. We're giving them the stuff they need now, and sure, they'll pay us back later if they can. Oh, and then also right after that, we will eventually extend the Lend-Lease Act to the Soviet Union because, Hitler invades the Soviet Union very stupidly, and now the Soviet Union's involved in the war as well. And because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, we are now frenemies with the Soviet Union, and we begin to lend-lease stuff to them as well. But despite all this, America is not going to war, and most Americans are still opposed to the war. So what does get us into this war? Well, that's a topic for our next conversation. So until then, take care, and bye-bye.